So I am really delighted to be here this evening and to add a few thoughts and ideas about this fascinating mix between the built environment, sustainability, government, good stories, bad stories, glasses half full, glasses half empty, looking around the room, mostly half empty, I notice at this stage of the evening. It is a bit difficult because obviously you expect me to try and be funny about this stuff. And by and large, humor and the end of life on Earth don't really go together very well. I've noticed over the years that it's not a good mix. And I keep saying to people when they say, we'd really like you to do a after-dinner talk, I say, okay, but you do know there are no jokes in the apocalypse. Happily, I'm going to save all that up for the end of my speech. Okay, I'm just giving you a little bit of warning now that we start bright and cheerful and we end up seriously depressed and gloomy, just so that you know what the rhythm is like, so you can gear your own psychological state of mind to where I am this evening. And of course, I start in the obvious place, which is to say how pleased I am to be here this evening for the International Building Presses Awards for a group of journalists for whom I have huge respect and admiration. I'm just saying that to suck up to you all at this early stage in the evening, but I do. Because Forum for the Future, when we set up Forum for the Future in 1996, we did not really anticipate that one of the biggest sectors that we would end up working with would be companies involved in the built environment. And by 10 years into the history of the Forum, in fact, the biggest single area of work that we had was relating to the built environment and feeding sustainability into all of those concerns and considerations about the built environment. So for me, this was an increasingly important area of concern for the Forum, and our connections with companies as diverse as Carillion, who I've been advisor to now for more than 10 years, with Arup, with Balfour Beatty, with Skanska, all of these companies with whom we've done a lot of work has been really important. And of course, for me this evening, I'm here primarily as a non-executive director of Wilmot Dixon, rather than founder director of Forum for the Future. That has just been the icing on the built environment cake for me, for a reason I'll explain in a moment. So I have read a lot more of the articles published in your magazines than you might imagine. And I have watched with huge interest how sustainable development, this somewhat strange, geeky little notion, has gradually infiltrated into the work that you all do. Well, all may not quite be right, but most of you do. And I say that with some joy because I stand in front of you here this evening as an unapologetic, self-confessed, sustainable development wonk, as I was recently described by someone who was getting quite cross about the number of times the word sustainable development was used in any one meeting. I even wrote a short treatise on the origins of sustainable development as a concept back in 2008. Please don't worry, I'm not going to be talking to you about that this evening. If you want to talk to me about that afterwards, please do, but just be warned, I will probably be gone by then, because I know it doesn't work very well at this time of the evening. But as an SD wonk, an unashamed SD wonk, I do keep an eye on what is going on out there. And of course, I keep a very close eye, in particular, on the greenest government ever. That's one of my tasks, really, is to hold politicians to account and see whether or not the very high levels of rhetoric that they have all now learnt to achieve have any bearing whatsoever on the reality of what they actually do. It's one of the key jobs for a sustainable development activist. It's actually one of the key jobs for all of you journalists here this evening. So imagine my excitement a few months ago when I was tipped off by a colleague of mine on planning that over the weekend there was going to be a major announcement by the greenest government ever relating to the National Planning Policy Framework. And above all, I should listen to the media over the weekend because this would be something resembling a kind of orgasmic moment in the life of an SD wonk. I wasn't quite sure what that looked like, personally, but nonetheless, I tuned in. And as some of you will remember, when the National Planning Policy Framework was announced by the government, it was indeed all over the media. There were ministers to the left of us, ministers to the right of us, ministers in the middle of us, all the time telling us that planning was about a presumption in favor of sustainable development. Well, given that over the course of that weekend there were more references to sustainable development in the mainstream media than in the whole of my 9 years as chair of the Sustainable Development, I did indeed feel that this was quite a high point, until I decided to check up on precisely what the government had in mind in this definition of sustainable development. And I went instantly, of course, to that great authority about the greenest government ever, namely George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And I discovered that this was really quite simple. If you wanted a workaday definition of what sustainable development meant, it simply meant yes. That's what it meant. One little word. All that work I'd done on my treatise on the origins of sustainable development, set aside. All my interest in the 83 active definitions of sustainable development today, set aside. Actually, I have to say now 84, because I think we all really should be very, very thankful to the Archdeacon of London for giving us, in his grace earlier on this evening, an 84th plug for sustainable development. I was immensely impressed, I tell you. All that stuff, completely irrelevant. All you need, one little word, yes. That's the default assumption. That's what you need to know about sustainable development. I felt to myself, if only I'd had access to that kind of expertise before. If only I'd really understood that sustainable development was as simple as that. I could have pretty much stopped all this laborious campaigning work, all of this advocacy, all of this engagement with companies and governments and the media. It would have been so simple. As you all know, it isn't quite that simple. It may be a good default assumption for a government that is increasingly desperate about rediscovering what the concept of growth means in the UK economy, but sustainable development, I'm sorry to say, isn't that simple. Nonetheless, this government is intent on redefining a lot of the concepts that have once held sway in our lives. Never quite understood what Will Hutton in The Observer meant 3 months into this government's tenure when he described the government as the weirdest possible mix of Blairism and Maoism all in one place. And now I'm beginning to see what he really means. Those Maoist tendencies are really quite actively present today. And many of the things that we might once have understood, we suddenly have to rethink. So the old assumption, for instance, that most Conservative MPs would happily subscribe to a NIMBYist persuasion when it came to their own particular constituency, while simultaneously advocating a growthist persuasion when it came to the economy at large, we now know that we have to recalibrate that against the new National Planning Policy Framework. NIMBYs are really out now. You have to recategorize politicians today against two new categories. On the one hand, bananas, and on the other hand, what I call the Babanances. Now, the bananas you're probably familiar with, which is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. It's a kind of absolutist expression of NIMBYism, basically. NIMBYism essentially means your backyard. Bananas means just don't do it. Just don't do it at all. And bananarism has been a hallmark of good, defensive, anti-development tendencies in a lot of constituencies around the UK. We still have a lot of MPs in the UK today who are basically bananas, who would basically have you believe that the best policy is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. You know them. You interview them quite often. On the other hand, we have what I now describe as Babanances. And Babanances are build absolutely anything anywhere where you can stick it. You can do the acronym later, okay? Build absolutely anything anywhere where you can stick it. the fascinating thing for us today is that the Babonancy and the banana tendency can coexist in exactly the same person, in exactly the same MP, from 1 minute to the next, from the week when they're up in Whitehall doing really serious work about Babonancy, build absolutely anything where you can stick it, and then at the weekend they all turn into bananas. Because guess what? They're back in their constituencies. And lo and behold, we suddenly discover that their constituencies do not really support the idea of building absolutely anything anywhere where you can stick it. Psychologists describe this as cognitive dissonance, the ability to hold two completely contradictory ideas in the same brain at the same time. I have never in my life experienced a government that is more cognitively dissonant than this one. It's fascinating. I don't want you to think I'm bitter about this. I'm really not. The fact the government abolished the Sustainable Development Commission, an organization to which I'd given a great deal of care and attention over many years, didn't leave me bitter at all. Indeed, I have a great deal of respect and admiration and even affection for what's going on in this government. To prove this, let me just give you a little insight into how I cope with my own nervous understanding of what the government is trying to do. So, by way of affection, I like to think of many of the players in this government in terms of Dad's Army. Because Dad's Army, after all, is a program that many people, if not the majority of people, feel very warm and comfortable about. And when you're trying to understand what is going on in the Department of Communities and Local Government, can I urge you to think about it via the framework of Dad's Army? You know where this is going, obviously. So Eric Pickles, admirable, completely idiosyncratic, possibly utterly unique Secretary of State, obviously presents himself as one of the most powerful Captain Mannering figures that politics has ever seen in the UK. Sergeant Wilson, the urbane, pleasant, intelligent, but permanently sat upon Sergeant Wilson. Those of you who know Dad's Army will instantly see that Sergeant Wilson has to put up with Captain Mannering in everything that he does. I haven't quite worked out where George Osborne fits in this yet, but possibly in the role of the air raid warden. George Osborne, of course, is very outspoken about sustainable development. Not only is the default position on sustainable development yes, but of course he let it be known most recently, quotes, anything that stands in the way of growth in the UK economy from now on will be flattened. It's quite a, I sort of said end quotes, sorry, just in case there are any journalists here this evening. It's quite a strong position, really, for a Chancellor of the Exchequer to take. Anything that stands in the way of growth will be flattened. Now, we know, of course, the air raid warden in Dad's Army was really all mouth and no trousers. And in that respect, I sometimes wonder whether George Osborne has any clothes at all, in as much as he does present himself as an emperor in this particular area. Now, I am conscious, as I finish, that you may wish to categorize me this evening as somewhere between a NIMBY and a banana. As someone who probably coming from an SD, sustainable development perspective, has no real concern for what gets built here in the UK. I just need quickly to dispel that stereotype before we get on to the really enjoyable part of this evening, which is to hear about the awards themselves. I want to dispel the stereotype because most sustainable development activists deeply resent being thought of as people who are anti-development. The reason why we're passionate about sustainable development is it's not the same thing as NIMBYism, let alone bananarism. The reason why I am so proud to be a non-executive director of Wilmot Dixon is because we build stuff. We put up real buildings in people's real communities to improve real lives. The reason why this agenda matters so much to me is because actually I want to see us building so much more in the UK than we're building today. I'm deeply depressed about the difficulties that we have dealing with some of these issues. I want to see hundreds of thousands of new homes built in the UK. Not some distant point in the future, but as soon as we can get them built. I want to see millions of homes retrofitted here in the UK, and in that regard, welcome the somewhat tentative consultation that we now have about the Green Deal. I want to see hundreds of thousands of empty homes reoccupied, improved and reoccupied here in the UK. I was glad to see the priority in the government's new housing strategy about doing something about empty homes. With a little bit of expert advice, I'm told that the 100 million that is on offer for the empty homes isn't exactly new money, which is a bit of a shame, but then we're used to the fact that new money is very rare and recycled money is very familiar, but at least there's an extra 50 million to help make that work in different places. I want to see hundreds of new development schemes to promote new energy systems for people in the UK, whether we're talking about onshore or offshore wind, about PV, industrial scale or small scale, whether we're talking about energy from waste, anaerobic digestion, a whole host of new technologies in that area. I want to see new build on transport systems, on cycle paths, on priority bus lanes, on renewable generated transport systems for the future. I want to see this stuff now coming forward through the planning system as fast as we can possibly get it. It's so frustrating to see so little progress on infrastructure and development, sustainable development of that kind here in the UK. So frustrating. So why do we find this so difficult in the UK? Why is it that we haven't really had a government for the last 30 years that understood how to do the combination between good growth on the one hand and serious sustainability on the other? That's the reconciliation that matters more than anything else in all of our worlds today, is reconciling the need for good growth with the need for serious sustainability. You know that. You see it week in, week out, that we need both of those things in tandem, working in mutually reinforcing ways rather than working against each other. We saw that blow up in the faces of the old Labour government when they got the Eco-Towns proposal so fundamentally wrong to begin with. We've seen it blow up, in my opinion, now with the National Planning Policy Framework, with Captain Mannering bumbling around telling people that it's very different from the way that we think it is. Funny that. It takes quite something to get a combination of the Daily Telegraph and the National Trust to rise up against a Conservative government on a central area of policy in a way that now threatens the very stability of that policy. How do you do that? How are you so utterly incompetent that you can't think about reforming the policy and planning system of this country without alienating the Daily Telegraph and the National Trust? Trust is the operative word. Trust is the operative word. And there is very little trust about what it is that people are currently bringing forward about that reconciliation between growth and sustainability. And without that trust, it'll all disappear yet again into the ether. So that's it, really. I hope you will all notice that I've got to the end of my comments without giving you any eco-tract about disappearing biodiversity, accelerating climate change, rising commodity prices, overfishing, loss of all the things that we really cherish in our life in terms of the natural environment. None of that this evening. Glass half full, all the way through. And why? Because we are about to celebrate the work of many of the people here this evening who seek in their own magazines, in their own newspapers, on their own websites, to achieve that reconciliation between what good growth looks like and what sustainable development really looks like. It is not easy. As you can tell from my comments, I don't think we're making a very good job of it here in the UK. But in the award-winning stories and the award-winning journalists that we're about to celebrate the achievement of, you can at least begin to see what that reconciliation looks like in practice and just how important it is going to be for all of us in the future. So thank you very much for inviting me here this evening, and I look forward now to doing a much easier job, which is just dishing out the awards at the relevant moment. Thank you very much.